You want to engage in social media. You want flyers that work. The written word. How do we grab attention? How do we do a fantastic body? And how do we get people to act? The secrets are in this video. Okay. How to move your audience with flyers, posts, and articles. And this is introduction version 2, part 1. There's going to be a second part, which will just be some of the more details. But today you're going to get the real sort of important meaty parts. An undelivered message does not exist in the mind of the audience. So for a long while now, for the last few years, a lot of people have been trying to deliver a message, and it's not really been received by the people that need to read the message. So what we need to do is we need to become very effective with our messaging so we can have that changed. So there's one thing that we really want to understand when it comes to anything that we want to set a goal, and it's this thing called outcome versus output. Now, it's actually relatively simple. Output is really something we're going to produce, and then outcome, did that output have the outcome we wanted? So as an example, if there was a traffic junction and people were turning right when they shouldn't, the people, to try and solve the problem, they may put up some signs, they may paint the road, etc. Now, it may be the case that the people that are building the sign and painting the road, they may do a perfect job, but people may still turn right. So the output was achieved very well, but the outcome has not been achieved. So one of the biggest things that we've noticed over the last 2 years is that lots of the experts have had it in their mind. All they need to do is just output, produce the facts, deliver them, and that's it. Everything will be done. However, the behavioral science guys that have been working for the government, they know that that's not the key. The key is to work out what the outcome is and work towards that. So they've been very specifically working on getting an outcome rather than developing outputs. So really the output is the things to do, but the outcome is, did it solve the problem? So if you had a flyer and you wanted 100 people to turn up to a meeting, that would be your outcome. You would develop a series of outputs, and then you would measure, did I get the outcome that I want, and did it have the impact I want? So that's just one thing to bear in mind, that if you measure it by outcome rather than outputs, you're going to have a lot more success. So what we're going to look at today is a really simple model to how to get good with the written word, flyers, and posts. The first thing we need to know is, what is the purpose of the message that we're producing? Then when we know that, we're going to look at what is the framing of this message. And that's a very important point that we will explain what that means. Then within the message, we need to grab attention. We need to have the body of the message, and then we want a call to action. So the ABCs. So the whole point of this is to produce a nice simple model that when we're going to produce anything, we can use a template that will enable us to do an output very well and hopefully get the outcome that we want. So ABC. So we need to have a purpose. We want to know our framing, and just the ABCs, this simple. Now here's a classic example, which is quite funny if you read it closely. Have you seen this dog? Now have a good day. Okay, so the purpose of this message was to make people smile, any passerby. So the purpose really is to know the outcome of the audience. The framing, so they frame this as they've used the standard advert for a missing pet. Most people have seen these hanging around. The attention, nice striking image and a bold question. The body of the information is, this animal can bring you a smile. And then the call to action is just have a great day. So in any message, if we fill out these 5 boxes, then we're going to do, I think, a really much better job. Okay, so just a few notes before we get into it. So we've used lots of examples in this presentation to demonstrate points. There will be examples of disagreeing with the message. So in fact, there's a lot of messages that we're looking at that will be official government messages, and I completely disagree with them. But we're looking at the skill in the delivery of the message, not the message itself. So observe the method rather than the message. And the intention is to simplify all of this for practical use. So then we can really just get better and better at our messaging. There's no point in really delivering lots of complex ideas if we don't incorporate them into our muscles. So let's look at the first one, the purpose. So I'm going to use an example of one that I did recently. So whenever I'm developing a presentation, whenever I'm delivering, doing a flyer or anything that's important in a letter, I will literally ask these three questions. So I say, what do I want to say? Really, what is the point that I wish to make? And what outcome effect do I want to have? And then who is the audience? And when I answer these three questions, it gives me a really good understanding of the sort of problem that I'm looking to solve. So in one of the recent workshops I gave in London, what do I want to say? So this was when I was doing the flyer. So I want to inform and show the value of the workshop. Yeah, so that's really what the purpose of the flyer would be. What outcome? I want people to attend the event. Who is the audience? People wishing to find a way through. So this really starts to clarify in my mind, what is the purpose of what I'm doing? If you don't know the purpose of what you're doing, it makes things really, really difficult. So really, there's the questions and there's the answers. So that's at the top level, the purpose. So then really, when we look at so many of the messages that we've been providing over the last 2 years, we've literally just been throwing facts at people. And this is the Joe standing on the soapbox is really showing that what we tend to do as people, and particularly most members of the public, is we stand on the soapbox. The soapbox represents our reservoir of knowledge, memories, belief systems, all the things we think we know, and we project that out into the world and into our conversations. That is just normal for us to do. A certain wisdom comes, as in the two umpires that I speak of, where one umpire will say, I call it as it is, and the other umpire will say, I call it as I see it. So once we have the certain wisdom to know that this is what we do, we know that everyone's soapbox is unique, and the way I see things is not objective reality. It's just the way I see things. So what we've been doing is throwing facts at people over the last few years, and they just bounce back, predominantly because the facts differ from what they currently believe. We may be in a different group, any number of the things that we show in the other videos. So the real key point of this slide is 1 point delivered is better than 10 rejected. So what we tend to see is with so many flyers, people are trying to cram so much information into a flyer. And that really doesn't work. It's very confusing for the brain. When you look at the government messaging and many of the authorities, it's very slick, simple, clean, 1-2 messages, okay? Repeated over and over again. So now let's have a look at context and framing. What do we mean by this? So really, it's really to focus on the framing aspect for today's, but we're going to make a few notes on context. Context affects meaning. It cannot be ignored. It functions often as one of the most important aspects to consider. So it's really, and we've got a presentation on the website on context, and I really advise watching that because it really will explain a lot of why context is so key. And just to give one example, they did a study where they had 15 headlines and they rotated them around 4 magazines and then tested the believability factor on these headlines, same headlines, but depending on which magazine it appeared in, it actually completely changed the meaning, whether people believed it or not. So the headline itself, so where something appears is really, really key, and the context in which it appears is massive. Or you can see our YouTube channel for those presentations. So what is framing? So framing's actually had a lot of attention in the last few years, and this is one of the official definitions. As one of the most popular concepts in current research on journalism and mass communication, framing refers to the idea that actors, like strategic communicators, journalists, but also audience members, select some aspects of a particular issue and make them salient while other aspects are ignored. So really it's choosing to how to look at something. And what you'll notice with the media now is it's framing stuff more and more each and every day. So it tends to not only show you what to look at, but it tends to want to tell you what to think about it as well. So that was from the oxfordre.com. And this was another definition: to invoke fear and panic among the audience. The media introduces a problem frame, which presents a complex issue in a simplistic way to entertain their consumers. And this was an essay on the framing within the media. There is a book that looks at this in detail, and I highly recommend it. It's called Slanted by Cheryl Atkinson, and she also did a TED talk, which I'd highly recommend watching. It's only 10 minutes. I think it's on AstroTurf. So she shows that pretty much now, most people that watch the old corporate media could be living a Truman-esque reality, in that they're so detached from reality, the media now, because it's really just corporate mouthpieces. So I would definitely recommend watching that TED talk. It's very eye-opening. So here's a classic example of framing. So here was CNN, which, this massive conglomerate went up against Joe Rogan and lost. And this was one of the headlines that they said: Joe Rogan, controversial podcast host, says he tested positive for COVID-19. Now, look at the wording, controversial. So they're trying to demean him. They're trying to make him look less than. And then, of course, they had it influential, and said he'd embarked on a fringe treatment regime. So look at these words. There's also another one that said, takes horse deworm. So basically, it's to put everything that he does in a bad light. So that's what CNN's narrative is to do in here. And sometimes it can be so subtle, but framing is so powerful. So here's the slam frame. This is very popular in the US. So there's something about so-and-so slams so-and-so. You'll see this everywhere. So look at this. Scientists slammed Joe Rogan's podcast. CNN slammed. Spreading misinformation, slammed. So you'll just see it everywhere. So basically, what they're trying to do is they're taking something that's happened and tried to make it appear that that something is controversial and wrong. And what they will often do is then just say expert or lawmaker or blah, blah says this person is spreading misinformation. So it's really just to create this frame so people dismiss it. This made me laugh in there for a bit of comedy. The old journalist frame, this was Louis Heron, who said, when a politician tells you something in confidence, always ask yourself, why is this lying bastard lying to me? I think they're wise words to be. So his frame is, obviously caution, to not be naive. Okay, coming back to now the ABC, so let's look at attention, which really is the key. There's no point having an absolutely incredible message if no one sees it. We've got to grab attention before we do anything. This is obviously something we want to do ethically, and something that, if you look across the internet, you'll see clickbaiting everywhere. But what is fascinating, when you become a student of this, I mean, if ever I go into London now, I find it really fascinating to look at the adverts and really look in detail at what they're doing and why they're doing it. And it's very interesting to witness communication. So these are the attention do's and don'ts within, grabbing someone's attention. Number one is a striking image. I found this image really striking. Again, it wasn't something I wouldn't feed my dog this, but, these two pictures really give this striking image. Two is you really want it personal. So anyone, that wishes to lose weight would look at this and they would, it would strike a personal note with them. Again, it wouldn't be a company I'd use, but, and then three is relevant. So obviously this, this is a very hard hitting, powerful one, becomes quite relevant for anyone that has children. This one, again, not one that I particularly agree with or like in any way, but it's very emotional. So they've used a number of things here. And in part two, we'll start to look at some of the advanced things, which is at the bottom here where it says Tony, COVID-19 patient. They do that very specifically because the way the brain functions, if they told you 100,000 people got ill, it wouldn't really mean much. But when it's a single person, it's known as individual victim identifier effect. So they're doing a lot of things on this one thing, but the emotions are very key in grabbing attention. This one's quite funny. So the curious, surprised, and engaging. So that's what really a lot of clickbait does. I find that if they allude to something in the headline, you often will want to see what's in the body. So, this has to be used ethically, but I think it's really key because being curious is one of the most important things for getting people's attention. So here is something not to do. So really you want to know where to look on this was one of the flyer courses I did. This was one of the examples of how not to do anything. Okay, so this is a really disastrous attempt. I blocked the guy's picture and details out because I didn't think it was fair to put it up there, but the eyes do not know where to look. You don't know what to make of it. On a flyer or any message, the audience really should know, what am I looking at and what is the message? You know, what is this anyway? It's a clean, you know, you wouldn't automatically know what it is because it's not obvious. Number 7, avoid upsetting the audience. This is one of the most classic things, that someone produces hundreds of thousands of flyers to try and wake people up by telling them they're not awake. That's kind of a paradox. It just does not work. And in many of the other presentations, we explain why this is, but I think for simplicity, do not upset the audience you're trying to reach. There are examples of this. Some comedians do it very well, but it's best just to steer clear of it. Number 8 is really this concept of, you know, avoid triggering cognitive dissonance. It's really key. And the quickest way that you'll trigger cognitive dissonance in someone, to try and tell them a fact where they think it's different. That's just going to trigger dissonance. It just does not work. What you need to do is ask them either a question that alludes to it, because if you make a statement, it becomes black and white, and they've got 2 options. They either agree or they reject it. So that's why making conclusions is not good practice unless the person already agrees, or they're an audience that's sort of, you know, in agreement with what you're going to say. And avoid negative trigger words. So this come up on a meeting I was on the other day, and people were using the word narrative to suggesting something that we were going to do. And it really is one of these loaded words. So whenever you're producing flyers, memes, all these things, be conscious of what these words will do. So loaded words, you know, are best not to use, because it's very hard to get a message across, because the person will have preconceived ideas about those words. So words such as narrative and, you know, all these words, and when we use, you know, gene editing and all these things, we're going to be very careful what response is going to trigger in our audience. Sometimes that will be the very response we want to trigger, but we want to do it consciously. Okay, so here's just an example of putting all this together. One of the things I shared on Twitter, and this got huge engagement. I mean, the Twitter account's really new, and it's only got a few hundred followers now. But this had sort of 2,500 views in, I think it was like 24 hours. And really what I've done there is I've just, you know, this black and white, this signals nostalgia. We'll take a look at this in a minute, but nostalgia is one of the things that will really trigger people's engagement. But a film from 1946 on how to avoid despotism, you know, interesting to see how it's aged. So this creates a lot of curiosity, and people want to know what this is. And obviously, you know, there's an alignment here, because this was a very interesting thing to watch, which is why I felt okay making those statements. Then obviously you got the black and white that triggered nostalgia. And then this was something I saw in someone's tweet. I've absolutely no idea what it is, but just the title that they put actually made me curious about what it was, even though I couldn't give 2 hoots about it. And that's what's funny about it. And Robert Cialdini talks about this. I know Debbie mentioned this when he was reading a book in a library, and he asked the question at the beginning of the book, and he had no interest in it, but because he didn't know the answer to the question, he had to read the book to find the answer out, even though it wasn't something that he worried about. So there's something very powerful about asking questions that people don't know the answer to, because a lot of the time it opens a loop in the brain, and we like to close those. So really gain attention with a catchy headline is really useful. It's like 8 out of 10 people will read a headline, but only 2 out of 10 will click through, which really signals the importance of creating curiosity and a desire to look at the body. So really precise, personalized, and provoking. There's a link to a YouTube video here that I found really, really useful. And obviously when you rewatch the recording, you can note that down. So more on emotion, which was from this same video. So there was one gentleman that had, I think, 8 or 9 copywriters, and they just used 4 emotions, and they got, I think it was 20 billion hits, which is pretty incredible. And in that video link, it explains that. But the emotions that they used 4 emotions basically, which was history or nostalgia. Now you'll notice in so many of the movies now that they're using nostalgia. Okay, so in all the remakes and the reboots, they have people from the original cast, they play on the story from the, because there's something about watching something 20, 30 years ago that when we think about it, there's this real nostalgia about it. So I've noticed that in movies everywhere now. It's, you know, the whole Star Wars franchise really just tends to be a nostalgia fest. Humor, that should be pretty straightforward. You can get a lot of things across in humor. This one's really interesting, pride of knowledge. So when you find out that you were right about something, so when you can really show this to someone, or this last one, which is Schadenfreude, which I have to admit I'm guilty of a few weeks ago when I saw an article on one of the sports websites about, you know, Everton being in the relegation zone. I've got nothing against Everton, but it was just because of this Schadenfreude that it was interesting. So, you know, it got me to read the article, even though I don't support them, I had no interest in it. So these emotions within anything that we put in our messaging will really trigger a curiosity to look more. And I certainly found when I you know, certain posts I've done referring to historical events, I've got a lot more engagement than current events. Okay, so that's attention. So now the body. Okay, so really one of the key things within the body is a metaphor. Now here's again one of those historical events which is just really a story or metaphor. So the danger of asbestos was successfully hidden by politicians and paid industry scientists for 74 years before being banned in 1972. Now there's lots of sub aspects to asbestos, like it was banned in various times for various levels, but I choose one of the initial cases. But again, this got a lot of engagement in a very short space of time, and obviously it mirrors something that's going on at the moment. So story and metaphor becomes very engaging for people. This fluency that's really key. Again, this is one that I really don't agree with, but there's hands, face, space. There's something about, there's a cognitive bias known in rhyme, and the brain likes simplicity. So when you can read something and it can be simple, the brain remembers it so much easier. I mean, you've got these nursery rhymes, you've got all these acronyms, all these things. The reason they are used because they work so well. So fluency is really key. You don't want your headlines and your copy to not flow. It wants to flow. It wants to have a certain rhythm about it. And this is something that's really hard to describe. And you really only get good at it when you look at some really good copy, not so much the message, but that's been produced professionally. And then you contrast it with many of the sort of amateur that have been produced. You'll see a real difference in the fluency of the messaging. Draw on emotion. So obviously, you know, this is again one of those powerful things that's quite emotional. This is kind of ironic. Authority, credibility. Obviously, I've put this in as a reverse credibility, but we're literally scanning everything straight away. Does this have any credibility? And if it doesn't look professional, it will get ignored. I found this out when and also myself, when I'd be watching, you know, studying videos, within the first 30 seconds, I'm literally assessing, is this credible? Is this professional? Is this authority? So now we're going to look at, we're just going to touch on this. We've got whole presentations on what we call the influence factors, but effectively influence factors can be referred to as similar to nudges. So the nudge unit in the government is just looking at what are the factors, the elements that will influence a person. So I'm going to show a text that was used by the NHS to show 6 of the nudges they used, but you can use these ethically, but you know, we need to use these ethically, but here's a way that they've not been so used ethically. So there's 6 particular nudges or influences in this one text. So commitment, so they pointed out reached. So that suggests that you've been in the queue and you've now reached the top and you don't want to go back to the bottom. Top plays on the ego. Queue suggests that there's loads of people in there, so it must be a good thing. Scarcity, priority, you know, because, you know, you notice throughout the last 2 years, surprisingly, everything that we needed was in short supply, from toilet rolls to gloves or whatever it may be. Reciprocity, people love something when it's free. And then authority, well, or certainly to some people, the NHS logo. So this whole text was designed very carefully to be very influential. What's missing from this text is any mention of any informed consent or anything that might go wrong. So within the body of your message, here's some don'ts. Don't trigger someone's ego. That will really not be a good thing to do. This is quite funny. Tell the punchline first. How do you run a joke? So try not to make conclusions. You know, there'll be a situation where I do it, but I taught this because it's like telling the punchline of a joke before you've told the body of the joke. The person won't get it. And this is what drives the cognitive dissonance and a lot of time. And be very careful with our language. So as we touched on before with the narrative use, that try to avoid all trigger words. You know, if you really navigate those, then you can start to get a message really delivered. Now, just looking at a couple of, you know, examples of what not to do. There's no space. There's nowhere to breathe in this flyer. I don't know where to look. I don't know what to do. Yeah, it's not simple. It's not easy to understand. Same with this one. Far too much text. Yeah, this was even a bank flyer, and they don't tend to make those errors. But it looks like a lot of work, doesn't it? So the brain's just not going to want to do that, unless, of course, you've grabbed someone's attention. Here's another classic example. Just too much going on. Don't really know where to look. Text is too small. Trying to cram everything in. So really on the body. So now, once you've grabbed attention, you've delivered your message, then you want a call to action. So there's your ABCs. So call to action, again, another classic example. Whilst this is probably ones that I strongly disagree with, it's really powerful, and it's been very powerful. And then they've got the call to action. Yeah. And again, you see this very, very simple. And here's one, you know, again, the call to action's there. So what do you want the person to do? That's your call to action. You grab their attention, you deliver a message, and what do you want to happen? Okay, so that's in summary of really the things that you want to understand when you're developing a flyer or post, all these things. You want to know the purpose. And within the purpose, it's going to be the audience. Who am I talking to? What do I want to say? You know, and what is my outcome? Be very clear and specific on those, because you'll find that a lot of the time you'll completely change what you wanted to say or how you'll say it. Then within the message, what is the context and what is the frame I want to put around the message? And then when you do that, attention, you know, you've got to grab the attention, you've got the body of the message, and then your call to action. And if you use this as a nice simple template around practicing messaging, I think and also seeing the effect that the message has, I think you'll see a lot more success. Okay, so if anyone would like to donate, support the project, you can do so here. And you can contact us at info@reachingpeople.net, and many videos on reachingpeople.net, and a lot of content that we will be uploading as we get time to do so. So I shall open it up for Q&A.